Alright, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a while since we've done a Genshin tier list, and with Genshin 5.7 releasing just recently, as well as getting some brand new DPS characters such as Veressa and Skirk, which we haven't talked about yet, then I think it's time to update our tier list, especially because we have also had a brand new endgame mode come out in the Stygian Onslaught. So you know what, we might as well review our tier list and then make some changes, play some characters, which will maybe help you decide who to play, who to pull for, stuff like that. Now this is a free-to-play tier list, so I'm looking at these characters at C0R0, and also if they require a lot of, for example, C6 4-stars or a lot of 5-star supports with their constellations, then they will probably get punished for it. But if they don't rely on that, maybe they have some very good 4-star teams, stuff like that, then they'll probably benefit from it as well. But the main thing we're looking here at is C0R0. And I'm sure as we'll go along, you guys can see what I value in DPS characters the most. You know, this tier is supposed to be relatable. So, yeah, with that being said, we might as well hop right into it. There are over 30 DPS characters, so I'm not going to touch on that many characters too extensively, since, you know, I don't want this video to be way too long. But real quick, if you want to pick up any of these characters for yourself, then I have the perfect thing for you, and that's today's sponsor, Lootbar.gg. You can use Lootbar to top up on your favorite games like Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail and save up to 25%, which now applies on Xbox and PS5 as well. Lootbar leverages favorable exchange rates and uses Hoya versus partner routes, so you can get the most affordable prices and still enjoy the top-up bonuses you would in-game. Transactions on Lootbar are safe, simple, and secure, as you only need to enter your UID and your region, and you will get fast delivery. I decided I'm going to buy one of my friends the Welkin Moon as a little gift, so I just go here, copy and paste their UID, and then just have to enter their region, and then I just press top up now, and I received my purchase in literally less than 10 seconds. Creators like Ride and Shotgun, Tevat Times, and Mordex Tryhard are also collaborating with Lootbar, so they are trustworthy, and they also have thousands of positive reviews on Trustpilot. And I've used it myself before, so I can vouch for the authenticity, speed, and security. New users can also get an extra 8% off, so be sure to check out Lootbar with the link in the description. Thank you to Lootbar, and back to the video. Well, now then, to start off, we of course have to go to the standard banner, starting off with Diluc, who I'm personally putting in the D tier, just because, you know, although he's a possible power DPS, I guess, you know, of course you have his plunge team, which is decent. I don't really think there's a reason you should be using it over other power DPS characters, since they are just that strong. You can say a similar thing for Keqing, also a standard character. You know, she did benefit from Dendro releasing. When Dendro first released, I could maybe put her a bit higher, but, you know, we've got quite a few good Electro DPSs nowadays, so I don't think she benefits that much from it. And also, Aggravate isn't as strong as it used to be right now, just because we have so many high-hitting DPS characters. Klee was the first limited DPS character released back in 1.0. Unfortunately, her gameplay hasn't really stood up. Her gameplay is fairly clunky. You know, she doesn't make as great use of some of the brand new supports as other characters, and also her damage numbers aren't just that justifiable to, you know, justify pulling her. You know, Diluc and Keqing you can have for free off the standard banner, and then maybe you can use them if you don't have a DPS in their element. But Klee, I don't think it's worth going out of your way to pull for. Now, when it comes to Child, he's actually a decent Hydra DPS character. In the past, he was definitely much higher. Although nowadays, I wouldn't really put him past the C tier, just because Hydra DPSs are some of the strongest in the game, alongside Pyro. He also doesn't make as good use of some brand new supports, like, for example, Shallonen, Mavika, stuff like that. Although you can play them in his teams, you know, when people think of Child, they do think a lot of his bread and butter. So, you know, once again, I feel like he hasn't benefited as much from brand new unit releases. Then on the other hand, Ganyu, who was of course one of the big 3 characters released back in version 1, I do actually think she's gotten a pretty damn big upgrade nowadays, and that's purely because of Escoffier. I do think in the past I'd probably put her like C tier, maybe even D tier, although probably C tier, but nowadays I think she's at least in the B tier thanks to Escoffier's release. You know, I'd say her freeze teams are now probably a decent bit better than her melt teams. You know, although I wouldn't put her on the same level as someone like Ayaka or Skirk, I do definitely think her teams are very serviceable now. You know, just the core of Freen and Escoffier are basically good for any cryo DPS character, so she's definitely more relevant than she used to be, especially in feasible content. And next up we have Xiao, who, when talking about the free-to-play tier list, like I said, although I don't want to punish someone too hard for having a premium team, requiring 2 5-stars and a C6 4-star, if it was 3 5-stars, I maybe wouldn't put him down the tier, but Xiao, I would probably put him in the D tier. You know, theoretically speaking, damage-wise, I'd probably say he's an A tier character, because I'd say he's a top 3 AoE DPS in the game. We don't actually have that many AoE DPS characters, so I do actually value that a fair bit. But because of how expensive his premium team is, and the fact that we also don't get as much AoE content in the game as we do single target right now, you know, the Stygian Onslaught game mode is fully boss dependent. In Imaginary Theater, the hardest stages are bosses, and in Abyss, we have seen way more bosses release. So, yeah, I would put Xiao in the beta right now, despite all of the buffs he's received. Next up, we do have Hu Tao, who I do think is still the best version 1 DPS character. I would still put her in the A tier just about. Once again, there are just so many good pyro DPS characters, but I do still feel like someone like Hu Tao is pretty damn serviceable if you do own her. Even at C0R0, I'd say she's still pretty damn good. I would still put her in the A tier. I'd say maybe soon she'll fall off into the B tier, but I think she can cling onto the A tier just about. And next up, we have Eula, who, if I'm being honest, I don't really think her gameplay fits Genshin that much at the moment. You know, of course, she does do some decent nuke damage, but then characters like, for example, Moalani or Mavika can just do that nuke damage much easier, much more reliably, and have better supports. You know, physical, although it exists in the game as a niche, I don't think it's a niche that anyone should be pulling for or is really required for the game. Next up, we have Yoimiya, who I would put in a similar tier to Diluc. You know, she has technically gotten a few new teams thanks to some of the new supports which are released, for example, Shalonen or Setlali. But at the same time, I just feel like there are much better options. You know, Hu Tao, Lini, Alakino, Mavika, they're all some of the strongest DPSs in the entire game, and they're all also Pyro. That's the problem with Pyro DPSs. You have to be strong to compete with the top, otherwise you're just kind of going to fall off in relevancy. Although next up we have Ayako, who I would actually put as probably the best aged version 2 character, maybe just the best aged character in general, because I would before Skirk released, some people would even put her in the top 5 after Escaffier's release, but you know, just one version after Escaffier's release, of course, Skirk has just released. But I would actually still put Ayaka in the S tier. The core team of Escaffier and Farina just feels very, very good to play. You can put Ayaka on Mars Say, so she also feels better to play against bosses because you're not losing her out on 20% from Blizzard's Trayer, and because her burst applies so much cryo, you will still get the 15% from cryo resonance, so you can still actually very easily hit 100% crit rate on Ayaka. And then you can also throw in someone like Shenhe as well, and she will just do insane amounts of burst damage, stuff like that. So I would, and also the cryo DPS will help as well, and then also the cryo pressure from Shenhe's burst, stuff like that. So I would actually still put Ayaka in, probably as a top 7 DPS in the entire game, definitely top 10, in my opinion top 7, which is why I am putting her in the S tier, because that would be my requirement. Next up, we do have Raiden, and C0R0 Raiden is still actually a very good unit. You know, you can use her as a Hyper Bloom trigger, Electro Applicator, a sub DPS, maybe dual DPS teams a bit. But yeah, Elemental Applicator, stuff like that, for example, Quicken or for Overload. She is actually pretty damn good at that, but purely speaking as a DPS, because this is a DPS tier list, we're only evaluating her as a DPS and not as a unit. As a unit, I'd honestly put her somewhere in this ballpark, but purely as a DPS, I would put her in the C tier. I don't think she's aged that well as an Electro DPS, and we've also just received so many Electro DPSs, or not even just so many, but just some really good ones. And then we also have some pretty good Electro offfielders as well, which does make the need for Electro onfielders as strong. But even then, we have characters like Versa and Clarant, who I would definitely put above Raiden. So yeah, and then next up we have Ito, who unfortunately, although I love Ito as a character, he isn't even the premium Geo team anymore. Navia would take that throne, so I would have to put Ito in the D tier. He doesn't take advantage of new supports, even new Geo characters, like for example Chiori or Shalonen. Although you can play them with Ito, he doesn't take full advantage of them. You know, so I would definitely put Chiori, not Chiori, someone like Navia over him. And like I said, unfortunately, Ito doesn't really have as much of a place in the game right now. Ayato is a DPS who actually gets memed on quite a bit. I do actually think Ayato is a bit underrated. I would love to put him in the B tier, but with some of the characters coming up later on, I can't really justify doing that. So unfortunately, I would have to put Ayato in the C tier. But hey, try out some Ayato mono hydro teams. My favorite one is using Farina, so that he can go on Marshal Say alongside someone like Yalan, and then you can run like a Shenyan on TTDS, or like a Jean for Viridescent, or even a Shalonen as well, because she can heal as well. I actually think those teams are very fun to play and pretty damn good, so you know, try it out sometime if you need some Hydro, and you do have him. Next up we do have Tignari. Now, although I do think he's a decent Dendro DPS, probably the best standard character in the game, I would still put Tignari in the... yeah, I'd probably have to put him in the C tier, because you know, Al-Haytham and Knish there aren't that many Dendro DPSs, but then I'd say Knish and Al-Haytham are a decent bit better than Tignari. I'd say they're probably a bit more flexible as well. You know, Knish can make use of Natlan mechanics. Al-Haytham can be played in Quicken or Quick Bloom teams, so yeah, that's why Tignari will be going in the C tier. Although if you get some constellations for him, he can actually be pretty damn competitive. Sino, unfortunately, also going in the D tier. I'd say performance-wise, a bit similar to Kitching. And if you're a free-to-play, not only would you have to justify pulling for him, his teams are pretty damn expensive. You know, he quite likes Farina, Baiju, characters like that. Now he does stuff like that, so you know, I wouldn't really justify putting for Sino, and his DPS numbers just don't make up for it. Next up we have Nilo, who was actually probably like around version 3, I would say probably a top 5 unit, but I do think her playstyle is just, you know, her gameplay is just slightly not traditional in the DPS sense, although she's still pretty damn serviceable as well, especially in AoE, so I would still want to put her in the B tier just for her uniqueness and stuff like that, although I can't really justify putting her much higher. Of course, I don't have her, so maybe some Nilo mains could prove me wrong, but personally, I would be putting her in the B tier. When it comes to Wanderer, I do feel like someone like Xiao has a niche in that AoE, and then Chaska, of course, is very single target focused. Wanderer, I just don't feel like has the access to teammates that those two do. You know, for example, Xiao has like the likes of Frina, Shenyan, and C6 Farazan as a very very comfortable and tailor-made team for him. Whereas Wanderer, of course, you have C6 Farazan, but other than that, you know, you have some decent support options, but I don't feel like they synergize as well with someone like Xiao. And then, of course, for Chaska, you can just play Setlali Movika, just put her on like a wheelchair team, and she's really busted. So yeah, Wanderer, I don't really feel like has that much of a niche, so I would probably put him in the C tier. You know, probably higher C tier, but still C tier nonetheless. Al-Haytham, previously a top 3 DPS, you know, used to be looking at like Arlecchino, Novlet, and Al-Haytham. But of course, after Mavika's release, I would say that he is no longer in the top 3. And also with the rise of Natlan mechanics and stuff like Endgame, I don't even think he's the best Dendro DPS in the game at the moment. So unfortunately, I will have to put him in the B tier. Although I do think power level wise, he is actually higher than the B tier. I just feel like in the current meta, I'd probably put him in the B tier. Next up, we have Linny, who I would actually put in the same boat as Hu Tao. You know, they're both very good pyro DPS characters. I'd say probably on the same tier. The problem is, of course, Mavika and Arlecchino are just that strong that I can't justify putting Linny and Hu Tao any higher. Next up, we have Novlet, who was the first DPS character who broke the game. I'd say there are probably 2 DPS characters who broke the game, with, of course, Novlet being the first one. I mean, just comfort-wise, quality of life-wise, stuff like that. Novlet, even though he might not have the pure highest DPS numbers, I mean, his DPS numbers are still very high. Let's not get that twisted. I feel like some people still underestimate Novlet's personal damage. But I mean, for example, there's team options. You can play him dual DPS with someone like Skirk or Movika to front load some damage, or you could play him in his hypercarry teams of like Farina, Kazaha, and Shalonen, or you can play him in freeze teams with Setlali and Escoffier. Those are just some very synergistic teams which just work very well and have not only very high personal damage for Novlet, but also some very good team DPS. So yeah, I would still put Novlet in the top 3, which is the SS tier for me. I actually would put Novlet as number 1 in my personal books, but for this tier list, which I'm trying, although it's still subjective, I'm trying to be a bit more objective. I wouldn't put him I wouldn't say he's necessarily number 1, but I'd say he's still undoubtedly in the SS tier. Risley C1, I would actually put in the S tier, but like I said, we're looking at C0R0, so I am probably gonna have to put Risley in the A tier. Of course, Escoffier, the good thing about Risley is, you know, he is very good both in freeze and melt. I do think he's a better melt DPS than Ganyu is, especially because you can play him with Mavika to really great effect to front load some more damage. And then also you can play him in freeze teams, which with Escoffier nowadays are also very, very strong. So I would actually put Risley even at C0 in the A tier. Maybe you could arguably drop him down into the B tier, but I'd just about put him in the A tier. Next up, we have Navia, who around Fontaine's time was definitely a top 5 DPS in the game. I'd say since, especially with some of the Natlan mechanics coming out, and then also some very high nuke DPSs, like for example, like I said before, Mualani, Movika, stuff like that. I do think I'd probably have to put her either top A or bottom S. I think for the meantime, maybe I'd have to put her in the A tier. I might reconsider. She's definitely a top 10 DPS in the game, but I'm not sure she's a top 7 DPS in the game, if I'm being entirely honest. I will have to come back and look at that. Arlecchino, however, was, like I said, at a point a top 3 DPS in the game. Of course, Movika released, and I'd say Movika is definitely stronger than Arlecchino, but I don't think it's by much. I don't think people should be doom posting Arlecchino. She's still very, very strong. The benefit she does have on Movika is she does have more team options. You can play her double Hydro Vape, you can play her reverse melt, you can play her in overload teams, stuff like that. I just feel like she has a lot. Mono Pyro as well feels very good for Arlecchino. So I would still put her in the S tier, definitely in the top of the S tier for me. Definitely a top 5 DPS in the game for me, but not quite top 3, so she doesn't quite keep her spot in the top 3. Next up, we have Clorand, who I do think is a top 2 Electro DPS, so if you want to put her or Veressa higher, I personally would put Veressa higher, but I still think Clorand just about makes it to the top 7. The reason being is because I do think after some characters, you know, when she came out, her Dendro teams were pretty damn good, you know, her aggro teams. But, you know, we've had Chevrolet's release, we've had Ianson, we've had Auroron, both of which can run Cinder City and buffer quite a bit, as well as Auroron can contribute decent damage, whilst Ianson's more of a buffer. But especially her dual DPS teams with Mavica in Overload, I just feel like are very, very strong, very nice in front-loading damage, and just some very good single-target damage, as well as some decent wave clearing. So I would actually still put her in the top 7, and I do think that synergy is what puts her just about above Navia, just for me, although I would really actually like to put Navia and Clarand in the same tier. If you know, you know. But I think for the time being I will stick with Navia in the A tier, although I might just change my mind last second. Next up we do have Mualani. Now Mualani is very interesting in that her damage numbers are still pretty damn high. The issue for me with Mualani is, first of all, I do feel like her gameplay is a bit clunky. And then although she does also make take advantage of Natlan mechanics, the thing is I don't feel like she really has a best installed team. You know, for a lot of these characters you can say either some very top teams or like their best alternative, stuff like that. Mualani, I'm not sure if she honestly has a top tier team. I thought Mavica would be like her best installed pyro applicator, because, you know, Shangling is obviously a good one, but then her energy requirements, especially solo pyro, are annoying. And then you can run someone like Dea or Tomo, but then you probably want it to be a burn vape team. So I actually would put Mualani in the A tier, because although she does have some very respectable damage numbers, I do feel like there is a bit of clunk to her gameplay. And then, you know, you do have someone like Mavica who is just easier to play and does higher damage numbers. So yeah, and then I'd also put Natlan as the better Hydra DPS. Next up we do have Kanich, who I actually would put above Alhaitham, although I do think strength-wise they are probably quite similar. Just with the abundance of Natlan mechanics, enemies like the Lava Dragon, stuff like that, I just feel like Kanich matches up better against the current endgame. So I would personally put him above Alhaitham, although I still wouldn't put him in the top 7, because I just do feel like there are better team options in the game. Next up, you do have Chaska, another Natlan DPS. I wouldn't actually put her on the same tier as Mualani and Kanich. I still feel like she's a pretty damn good character. Of course, an Anemo DPS, but she doesn't deal Anemo damage. The thing is, I just feel like instead of playing Chaska, you're better off playing someone like, you know, if you want a Hydra DPS, play Mualani or Novlet. If you want a Pyro DPS, play Mavica or Alakino. If you want an Electro DPS, play Varese or Clarand. If you want a Cryo DPS, play Skark or Ayaka. So yeah, I feel like although her gimmicks are very fun and she's very good in single target and also against Natlan mechanics, I feel like that's about it. And although her damage numbers themselves are pretty damn good and I do enjoy playing her, I just can't, I don't think I'd put her quite in the A tier. And then next up, of course, we have Mavica, who of course is the other character who broke the entire game. I mean, her pure damage numbers, just her burst damage, is just absolutely insane, especially in certain setups. Now, of course, you do need Citlali to unlock her full hypercarry potential, but even then, you can play her in teams. As long as you have like 2 Natlan supports, she's still going to be a top 3 DPS in the entire game, and if you have Citlali, she is definitely top 1 DPS in the game, so I don't want to hold it against her, although it can be harder. You know, Citlali isn't as universal of a support as someone like Farina, for example. I still don't want to take that away from Mavica. Also, she has some decent alternatives. You know, not only does she have hypercarry teams, you can also play her in Overload or dual DPS teams with the likes of Nevelet, Varese, or Clarand. So, for example, on my main account, I have Citlali. I play Mavica as a hypercarry. On my alt account, I don't have Citlali, and I tend to just use her in double DPS teams, and I still enjoy that very much. So, yeah, SS tier, just highest damage number in the games, and for the sake of this tier list, although I personally rather Nevelet, I will put Mavica as the number 1. Next up, we have Mizuki, who honestly I was really excited for her release. I had some potential for her. Honestly, I believed in her so much. I actually pulled a copy of her, thinking that maybe if I pick up some constellations of her, she will, like her C2, she'd feel actually good to play in AoE. Although unfortunately there isn't as much AoE content in the game. Also, as we can see from Stygian Onslaught, and then like I said, also Imagine Fatal, the hardest things are bosses, in Abyss, the hardest things are bosses. So unfortunately, I don't really feel like she has a place in the current meta, and then her damage numbers just aren't that great. Neither is some of her utility like her healing. But that brings us on to the final 2 DPS characters in the game, and those are our 2 newest characters, that being Varese and Skark. Starting off with Varese. Varese, I do feel like is the best Electro DPS in the game right now, so I would definitely put her in that top 7. Some people argue for her in the top 3, although her damage numbers might put her in the top 3, and then also the fact that her Overload team, you know, Chevrolet, Iansan, and Mavica just feels very synergistic and very good to play. I would still just about have her missing out on the top 3. Also, Clarand is very close behind her, so I do feel like they do kind of belong on the same tier, if I'm being entirely honest. You know, but like I said, though, her damage numbers are very strong. She also feels very fun and good to play. You know, I do feel like her gameplay is fairly refreshing. It's a different type of plunge gameplay from Shan, which I actually really appreciate. I do like her 2 best mode, even though you end up only using one of them most of the time. Her rotations feel very fluid. She does have quite a lot of quality of life, in my opinion. And like I said, the ability to front load damage with Movika in her team is just great. And also the great thing about her teams is her best in slot team uses 2 4-stars. And on top of that, you don't need their C6. It's not like a Shao situation where C2 Farazan, for example, feels much worse than C6 Farazan. Although C2 Shevers and C2 Yansan are, you know, a bit worse than their C6 versions. For Veressa, I don't feel like you need their C6. Just, for example, C2 gets the job done, in my opinion. So yeah, as long as you have Iantan and Shivers, even at, you know, C0 or C2, she will still feel like a top 5 DPS in my game. And if you have C6 Shivers, C6 Iantan, and Movika, then I do feel like, you know, maybe she even feels better to play with Alakino. She's definitely a top 5 DPS in the game, in my opinion, especially in her best case scenarios. And then you do also have her Shenyan teams, which I do think are a bit worse, but still feel decent to play. But finally, that brings us to the newest DPS character in the game, that being Skirk, who I will be putting in the top 3. I know there's some discussion. Of course, you know, her premium team, she does kind of rely on Farina and Escoffier, which isn't great because it means you can't use Farina on your other half. And you also need to pull Escoffier, who released just before her and is a bit of a niche support because she is basically only for cryo DPS characters. You know, if you don't have any cryo DPS, if you didn't have someone like Ayaka or Risley or and you don't want to play with someone like Neuvillette, then I wouldn't really recommend pulling for her before you get a Skirk. You better guarantee yourself a Skirk before you try getting Escoffier. But I just feel like Skirk's damage numbers are pretty damn high that I would still just about put her in the SS tier. I do feel like in her, as long as you have Escoffier and Farina, which, you know, people might not have right now, but it's kind of a similar situation to someone like Movika with Setlali. So even so, you know, also Movika has been going, admittedly, Movika you can also play with like Iansan, Bennett, and Shalonen, which isn't as good as the Setlali version, which I don't think I don't think Skirk really has an option. I do feel like she relies a fair bit on Escoffier, but on the bright side, the 4th slot on her team is fairly flexible. You can use Yelan, you can use Shenhe, and also, what's nice is you do, of course, have her dual DPS playstyle, which also makes Mona a viable 4th slot. Other than that, you can use someone like Setlali on Cinder City. Even Mualani on Cinder City and TTDS actually feels pretty fun to play on Skirk. So, yeah, I do feel like you actually do have some decent options when it comes to Skirk teams, as long as you have Escoffier and Farina. Even if you don't, there are some decent options. You know, Charlotte is a decent replacement for Escoffier. Admittedly, not the best, but at least you can put her on something like TTDS, stuff like that. So, yeah, I would just about put Skirk in the top 3. Her damage numbers are just pretty damn huge. She also has some pretty decent quality of life in her kit. Of course, she does have 2 playstyles. You can play her normal attack or burst, which is fun. And then also, what is my favorite thing to do in the game is to run both Movika and Neuvillette as dual DPS teams. I love running Veressa and Movika, as well as running, or also Movika Clorand as well. And then on the other half, running like Neuvillette Skirk. Just being able to front load damage on those characters, as well as have some consistent DPS, as well as a lot of flexibility in your rotations, is my favorite thing to play. I will have a video releasing where I actually do play some dual DPS teams in the Spiral Abyss, and I do feel like right now, although we might not be in a dual DPS meta, I do feel like dual DPS is actually a very viable path to go down in the future, and also very fun gameplay wise. So yeah, I would still just about put Skirk in the top 3. So yeah, this is my complete tier list. Let me know on your thoughts down below. Do you think any characters should be higher, any characters should be lower? Bear in mind, these are just my opinions. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions. I would actually love to hear your guys' opinions. You know, you can leave below your top 10 DPSs or your entire tier lists if you want. You can say what do you disagree with me on, what do you agree with me on. Like I said, because there's so many DPS characters, I do have limited time here, so I've had to go through things quite quickly, and it might be a bit hard to verbalize all of my thoughts in one go. So, you know, if you want to question any of my placements, be sure to go ahead, and I can try to explain myself better in the comments if you want. I also really enjoy having some fun discussion. Just make sure any criticism is constructive, stuff like that, because if it's too mean, then you know, then what's the point of replying? You know, be civil about it, be civil to each other in the comments as well. You know, people love disagreeing with each other. Just make sure, you know, this is just for a bit of fun. And also when it comes to if you're using this to decide what characters you want to pull, first of all, just pull for whatever characters you like. Genshin isn't that difficult of a game. Just pull for your favorite characters. That will make sure that you have the most fun in the game. If you want my personal recommendations, I'd say anything in these top 4 brackets are probably your go-tos for pulling. You know, these are the meta characters in my opinion. These are the ones which, if you like, you're lucky because they're very good to play. And then if any of these are your favorite characters, I mean, like I said, if they're your favorite, just pull for them anyway. Like I said, you can just use them in the overworld and you will have more fun in the game if you're playing your favorite characters, and then you can pick up any of these characters if you want to clear end game quicker, whilst also having some of your favorite characters. So yeah, that's all from me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Like I said, leave your thoughts down in the comment section down below. With that being said, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. See ya.